Zoro is going to turn all 3 of his blades black when he defeats Mihawk and gains the title of World's Strongest Swordsman. Why do I believe that this will be the moment where he achieves all black blades, and are these 3 swords, Wado Ichimonji, Enma, and Sandai Kitetsu, his final set of swords that will all be black by the end? Before we get into it, make sure to subscribe, and you've got a shot at becoming the world's strongest swordsman yourself as long as you eat healthy with Factor, the sponsor for this video. Listen, if you literally don't like cooking at all, like you don't just want meals that are easy to prepare, you don't want to have to ever prepare anything at all, period, then you need to be using Factor. If you're a lazy kid in college or a lazy adult like me, then don't make the mistake of just getting fast food over and over again. Factor delivers fresh, nutritious meals straight to your door that are completely prepared, that genuinely taste good, and are way better than the takeout that you were thinking of getting tonight. The food is prepared by chefs and it's never frozen, so you know you're eating right. And you don't have to waste time at the grocery store or cooking for hours on end. There's no thought required, no guesswork, just tasty, healthy meals, ready to go, delivered right to you. In general, Factor's made it way easier for me to manage my work-life balance, since now I know that as soon as I finish a stream late at night, I have something nutritious and delicious ready to eat right away. So head to go.factor75.com/morge120 and use code morge120 to get $120 off. That's go.factor75.com, morge120, code morge120 to get $120 off. Link in the description below. So that aside, to begin with, we can easily assume that Zoro will have black blades by the end of the story, as so far this does seem to be the measure of a truly legendary swordsman. At the moment, only Mihawk and Ryuma are confirmed to have black blades, and Mihawk is of course currently the world's strongest swordsman and Zoro's final goal, while Ryuma is essentially the version of Zoro from the past and has had the most praise placed upon him of any swordsman in the story so far. So what does Zoro's path to getting black blades look like? Well, it's a little complicated because we have no clear precedent for what it takes. We know that it takes many battles in theory, but the reality is that it's unlikely we're going to be getting that many high-level duels for Zoro by the end of the series. After all, even across the entirety of the Wano Arc, in the land of swordsmen itself, ultimately Zoro only got 1 duel against a decently strong opponent. I don't exactly expect Oda to fit in a lifetime of duels for Zoro in the next 200 chapters or so before the series ends. As such, I think Oda may play it a little loose with the exact requirements of what it takes to get black blades. Now, even though many believed Zoro should have turned at least 1 blade black in Wano, as this was an interesting idea that was developing throughout the arc, I'm personally not that surprised it didn't happen, as I think it would be really hard to believe that Zoro could win 1 fight against King and suddenly achieve what Mihawk and Ryuma did. No matter how loose Oda decides to play it with how many fights are needed to get black blades, Zoro getting it done in just 1 fight against a guy who isn't exactly among the world's strongest would be a bit too much of a stretch. I think these explanations about black blades throughout Wano are more so just establishing what we can expect of Zoro in the long term, by the time he has reached his peak as a swordsman in the story. Now on the flip side, a lot of people believe that even if Zoro didn't turn all his blades black in Wano, then he still should have turned at least 1 of his blades black by the end of the arc. And I personally disagree with this as well, as I think that would lead us down this route of Zoro having to turn his blades black 1 at a time, likely starting with the sword he's had the longest, Wado Ichimonji, then Sandai Kitetsu, and then finally Enma as the last sword. In the first place, as a personal preference, I think that would somewhat drag out the process and feel a little anticlimactic. Doing it 1 sword at a time, it would make the process of the blades turning black feel a little bit like just checking off boxes as though it's a to-do list. I do think it would be far more special for Zoro to complete a particularly difficult fight, and we get the reveal at the end that he's achieved the pinnacle of swordsmanship and his blades have turned black. Now that's obviously a personal preference for all the blades to turn black at the same time, but more importantly I think there is some strong in-story justification for why it would make sense for all 3 of his swords to turn black together, rather than 1 at a time. In the first place, turning a single blade black seems to be only achievable by reaching the height of swordsmanship. Again, literally only Mihawk and Ryuma have ever achieved this. As such, for Zoro to turn even a single blade black, that in itself basically indicates that he's reached the same sort of pantheon of legendary swordsmen that Mihawk and Ryuma have hit. Essentially, the moment of Zoro turning any blade black, be that 1, 2, or 3, that moment is basically the moment where he's probably reached the endgame of his development as a swordsman. He's accomplished the biggest feat that marks a legendary swordsman. So in that case, there's not really much point to having it happen 1 at a time. what's the point of having to wait a bit before turning the second sword black and then another sword black, because at that point it's just like extra icing on the cake. The real big achievement has already pretty much been accomplished with the initial black blade that Zoro has achieved. To me, that indicates it's more likely that he turns all 3 black at the same time. On the flip side, you could argue that maybe Zoro just turns Wano Ichimonji black by the end of the series as his most important sword. But at the same time, we already have the setup blade of Enma turning black and moving up a rank to become a supreme grade sword. So I do think that that's likely to happen to Enma at some point in the story. And since I doubt that Enma would turn black and Wano Ichimonji wouldn't, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to just go ahead and assume that Zoro will turn multiple swords black, and probably all 3 of them. Now the question would then be, how would all 3 swords turn black at the same time if Zoro has had them for such varying lengths of time? Wano Ichimonji he's been using for a decade, Sandai Kitetsu he's been using for 2 years, and Enma was picked up just a couple weeks ago. Well, I think it could make sense to all happen simultaneously, as in Wano we learned of maybe the most important aspect of high-level swordsmanship, being able to infuse your swords with Conqueror's haki. This seems to be a huge leap forward for Zoro. Advanced Conqueror's haki is, after all, a technique that is only used by the very strongest, as Kaido stated. We also saw it's the secret behind why Yonko are able to split the sky when they clash. And it also seems like this could be a huge step towards Zoro being able to use Ashura more frequently and sustainably. As it turns out, Ashura is tied to Conqueror's haki. We can also of course see a much different and more pronounced visual effect with Zoro's swords now that he's using Conqueror's haki while fighting. As such, I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that advanced Conqueror's haki usage is a huge prerequisite towards turning blades black, which would mean that the varying amount of time that Zoro has had each of his swords wouldn't ultimately be as much of a factor, as the point where Zoro started using Advanced Conqueror's haki with all of them is the same. Basically, I think this is the point from where on Zoro can actually start developing towards making his swords permanently black. However, here I do want to very briefly discuss something that's a little uncertain, which is whether this really is going to be Zoro's final set of swords. Again, right now we have Wano Ichimonji, Enma, and Sandai Kitetsu. Is it too late for Zoro to swap one of these 3 swords out? He did just learn Advanced Conqueror's haki and has begun using it on all 3 of these swords, and so there is the argument that with the relatively short amount of story left to tell, Zoro does kind of need to stick with these 3 if he's expected to turn a full set of 3 swords black by the end of the story. There may not realistically be enough time left for any more sword swaps, because any newly introduced sword after this would basically be starting fresh, and it may be unreasonable for it to turn black with just 1 or 2 fights up ahead. However, at the same time, looking at Zoro's sword roster right now, we have 2 Great Blade swords, Wano Ichimonji and Enma, and then 1, sword. It is technically at least a grade sword, but Sandai Kitetsu is not even one of the 50 skillful grade swords, so it ranks fairly low. Is Sandai Kitetsu really going to stay with Zoro till the end of the series? Even if Zoro turns it black, it only bumps up 1 rank to be a skillful grade sword, which is more like what I'd expect someone like Tashigi to be running around with rather than the world's strongest swordsman. I do think it'd be a bit odd if Zoro's made Wano Ichimonji a supreme grade sword, he's made Enma a supreme grade sword, and then he's just got Sandai Kitetsu, the skillful great sword. Now earlier in Wano, Nidai Kitetsu was introduced, but even though Zoro showed a lot of interest in the sword and it was brought up frequently, nothing really ultimately came of that. So at this point I think maybe it was just a random little inclusion in the arc. I don't know why it was important for Sukiyaki to have secretly been a swordsmith all this time, and I think it actually takes away a bit from the intrigue of Sandai Kitetsu to find out that this supposedly legendary cursed blade was actually made very recently by this failed shogun who just needed a hobby, but that's besides the point. Now that it seems clear that Nidai Kitetsu might not really matter, there's not really any reason to believe right now that Zoro will ever be upgrading from Sandai Kitetsu to that, unless at some point Zoro loses Sandai Kitetsu as he did with Yubashiri, and then maybe Sukiyaki can come in clutch with the replacement in some future arc. That is still a possibility. Not to mention Shodai Kitetsu is in possession of a member of the Gorosei, so there is still potentially some importance to the Kitetsu line of swords. Maybe we can expect some upgrades for Zoro in the future. However, ultimately what also needs to be considered is that Sandai Kitetsu isn't important just to Zoro, but also to a certain other forgotten character, Ipponmatsu, the shopkeeper in Logtown. Look, we know how important dreams are in One Piece, and unfortunately, Ipponmatsu's dream is to see Sandai Kitetsu in the hands of a great swordsman. As such, just as Zoro is carrying Queena's dream with him through Wano Ichimonji, it must also be acknowledged that he is also carrying Ipponmatsu's dream with him through Sandai Kitetsu. Is Ipponmatsu's dream that important in the grand scheme of things? I'd say no, probably not, but the fact that Oda still cuts back to him clearly fanboying over Zoro and basically living out his dream vicariously through Zoro's exploits, I don't know, maybe Oda is ultimately going to make Sandai Kitetsu go the distance with Zoro due to the sentimental value attached to the sword. So while it's interesting to think about future sword possibilities, I'm going to assume for the moment that this is Zoro's final roster of blades, though I wouldn't be surprised if something changes. If we assume that this is Zoro's final set of swords, then I don't think we were actually that far off from seeing Zoro turn them all black. Again, the most important development he had as a swordsman recently was mastering Advanced Conquerors haki, which seems to be the most powerful ability in the world, period. Zoro also just completed a high difficulty duel against a strong character, and he is also likely soon going to have a lot greater control over Ashura, which seems like an extremely high level swordsmanship technique that will benefit a lot from his improved mastery of Conquerors haki. And finally, just the fact that we only have so much One Piece left to read. I think it is very possible that the moment that Zoro turns all of his blades permanently black may be at the conclusion of his duel with Mihawk. It's hard to say how many duels Oda will be able to fit in before that happens, but if we assume that Oda is going to play it a little loose to speed up the process for Zoro getting black blades, then Mihawk seems like the right upcoming opponent in the next 1 to 200 chapters or so for Zoro to earn that achievement against. First of all, the duel with Mihawk itself will likely be the most difficult and arduous sword fight Zoro will ever have. And as we know, black blades are earned through battle. Considering Zoro is likely set up for an extremely high-level, extended sword duel against a legendary swordsman, the best in the world, that fight may be so intense and bring out so much of his haki and willpower that by the end of it, he will have turned his blades black. Beyond that, it would naturally be symbolically fitting, as the moment that Zoro finally surpasses Mihawk, well, I think it wouldn't feel quite right without Zoro having achieved the same swordsmanship feat that Mihawk has of having permanently black blades. It would seem only right that now that Zoro is a stronger swordsman than Mihawk, that he would no longer be missing that mark of great swordsmanship. He would no longer be beneath him in that sense. And finally, even though we know the world's strongest swordsman is a well-known title, it's not exactly like there's a trophy that's handed out for that. And it's not like there's a treasure like the One Piece to be earned as an achievement. As such, when Zoro defeats Mihawk to earn that title of World's Strongest Swordsman, I think the one single tangible thing that could symbolize his victory and Zoro's new status would be if that battle ended, Zoro emerges as the World's Strongest Swordsman, and his blades are now all black to signify his new status. Basically an undeniable visual symbol of him having achieved the highest level of swordsmanship in the world, and now having the same status as Ryuma, as Mihawk, etc. So let me know when or how you all think Zoro will get his black blades in the comments below, whether or not you agree or disagree, and if you enjoyed this video then definitely like and subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon to get my extended thoughts on this and all future topics.